All right. Hello. We are live from Occupy City Hall. Didn't get any lives or any content up yesterday. Want to apologize for that. Want to try to make sure as often as possible we try to get something up at an every 24-hour basis. So let's dive into In Defense of Looting by Vicky Osterwile. This is the Rockford reading segment of live from Occupy City Hall. Let me just all right, there we go. I just turned the headphones up, son. So, all right. Got it. A little short here in the headphones. All right. Okay, there we go. If it's any audio issues or connection issues, just give a shout in the comments, all right? Okay, we're on Chapter 6. Again, this is the Rockford reading segment of Live from Occupy City Hall, where we read pieces of literature and cross-reference how the ideology, tactics, or ideas presented in the literature we're reading cross-reference with the struggle to end police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice in Winnebago County, and how we can correlate these things and interject these things into the struggle that we're waging currently. Chapter 6, No Such Thing as Nonviolence. Sorry, that was rough. Okay. I don't know, was that the wind that did that? That might be the wind that did that. Okay. In the 400 years of barbaric, white supremacist, colonial, and genocidal history known as the United States, the Civil Rights Movement stands out as a bright, beautiful, all too brief moment of hope and struggle. We still live in the shadow of the leaders, theory, and images that emerged from those years, and any struggle in America that overlooks the work, both philosophical and organizational, produced in those decades does so at its own peril. However, why is it drilled into our heads, from grade school onward, in every single venue, by presidents, professors, and police chiefs alike, that the Civil Rights Movement was victorious because it was nonviolent? Surely, we should be suspicious of any narrative that the entire white establishment agrees is of the utmost importance. It is an appealingly simple narrative. In the 50s and 60s, there was the good, successful, nonviolent civil rights movement in the South, which in the late 60s and early 70s gave way to a misguided, violent Northern Black Power aftermath. This myth shapes not only our understanding of that period, but also our perspectives on modern social movement activity in America. The division between nonviolence and militancy, the former moral, normative, and widely supported, embodied by Martin Luther King Jr. in the March on Washington, the latter, unpopular, macho, and adventurist, represented by Malcolm X and the Black Panthers, did not exist until that period, but it has been used to attack and divide every movement since. When police and politicians claim that it is nonviolent protesters that they listen to and protect, they are using this myth against our own movements. It is why liberals, in the face of looting and rioting, share memes about what protesting used to look like, featuring picking lines of civil rights activists claiming that they would support that kind of protest. At the time, of course, even that kind of protest was unpopular among white liberals, and Martin Luther King Jr. called out the white moderate as the, quote, great stumbling block, end quote, to freedom. Though this myth is based on selective historical truths, the broader narrative is entirely false. To start with, there was no straightforwardly nonviolent civil rights movement. Nonviolence was a tactic designed at the time to appeal to northern white liberals for funding and support. Nonviolence proved itself effective in desegregating certain public facilities, particularly with the student lunch counter sit-ins that spread across the South in 1960. Throughout the 50s and 60s, however, away from the cameras, demonstrators and organizers armed themselves. Idealistic, nonviolence-trained freedom riders were guarded where they worked, lived, and slept by local people with guns, sometimes over their objections. One of the most significant struggles in the whole nonviolent pantheon the Birmingham, Alabama desegregation movement went from disciplined nonviolence to decidedly not nonviolent rioting, with local teens throwing rocks and attacking property and police in its final victorious days. The very image of disciplined philosophical nonviolence, Martin Luther King Jr. traveled with a heavily armed entourage. His home was protected by armed guards, and one visitor described the inside as, quote, an arsenal, end quote. Guns were a crucial part of the freedom movement. But what exactly was that movement? Although we learn about it in school as the series of struggles that achieved mass recognition, the Montgomery bus boycott, Little Rock, student sit-ins, freedom rides, Birmingham, the March on Washington, the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, Selma, the civil rights movement is better understood as the culmination of hundreds of local struggles against white supremacy, struggles large and small, across the entire country, unfolding across decades. These local movements share some infrastructure, ideology, and tactics, but had different histories, strategies, including rioting, goals, and results. Nor was the Black Freedom Movement predominantly driven by changes in federal law, Brown versus Board, the Civil Rights Act, and so forth, or by male ministers at the helms of a series of acronym national civil rights organizations. Organizational histories, legal narratives, and leadership biographies are easier to write, to research, and to tell than the real, messy, grassroots history of social movements. They leave a paper trail and a clear subject to focus on. Rather than the resulting action of following orders from on high, however, social movements were usually organized through direct democratic mass meetings, enabling the grassroots to keep or wrench power from the big-name leaders. Those national leaders generally brought more media attention and fundraising opportunities than actual organizational strength. The majority of movement work was done by local people, joined in struggle and facilitated by young, idealistic student activists and experienced black women organizers like Septima Clark, Ella Baker, and Joanne Robinson. Give me 1 second. All right. Also, there is no clean historical break between the civil rights era and the era of black power. People practiced armed self-defense, organized around economic autonomy, and fought for black community control, perhaps the core tenets of black power, throughout the years when nonviolent direct action was at its heights of renown. Similarly, black power and militant resistance cannot simply be reduced to Malcolm X, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and the Black Panther Party, important though they all are. As Jean T.O. Harris and Kamasi Woodard argue, the ideologies of self-defense, Pan-Africanism, socialism, and independent black political action all emerged from grassroots struggles. The leaders did not invent the rhetoric, ideology, and tactics of black power, but merely gave effective expression to them, as police and government commissions consistently discovered when they tried to find the instigators and conspirators behind urban uprisings. Hardly limited to the urban North, black power also wasn't predominantly a nationalist movement. It had an avowedly anti-colonial and internationalist perspective, connecting its actions in solidarity and direct alliance with third world liberation movements. Black power, in other words, was a popular grassroots movement built in both small-scale, local organizing and massive rebellions. The riots in Watts, 1965, and Newark in Detroit, 1967, are the most famous uprisings, but such urban rebellions by no means only occurred in the North. They spread across the entire country in dozens of major riots and hundreds of smaller ones. Between 1964 and 1971, 750 black riots and rebellions took place in the United States. Rioting and looting were not accidental offshoots of the Black Freedom Movement, not some, quote, opportunistic, end quote, or, quote, tragic, end quote, consequence of civil rights struggle. Instead, they formed a central part of the movement's power and effectiveness and a core experience of the movement for many of those who rose up against white supremacy. And finally, and most tragically, is the myth that the civil rights movement succeeded. It is often told that the fall of Jim Crow, the granting of the vote, and the destruction of openly racist laws via federal action through the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Voting Rights Act of 1965, and Fair Housing Act of 1968 achieved the core goals of the civil rights movement. Okay, I want to stop there because it seems like we're about to shift into a slightly different topic, and I don't think that we're real close to ending this first batch. Here, let's just go through and read till we get to the first little sort of checkpoint here, and then I'll just go through and reflect on all of it at once. From the start, the civil rights movement was about much more than the right to vote and the end of segregation. It always centered economic justice, freedom from violence, and communal autonomy. The movement's spark wasn't the Montgomery bus boycott against segregation in December 1955, but the national reaction to the lynching of Emmett Till that August. Safety from white violence preceded integration as a concern of the movement. As Robin D.G. Kelley argues, this radical and broadly focused movement was, quote, defeated on the shoals of race and property by liberals and neoliberals, end quote, who co-opted and redefined the struggle into terms that did not threaten their class position. Even as it was unfolding, the media, the government, moderate organizations, and white supporters worked to make it appear that desegregation and voting rights were the only demands of the movement, just as they worked to make nonviolence seem like the only viable tactic. Furthermore, the end of segregation laws did not mean the end of segregation. American public schools, perhaps the most important terrain of its integration struggles, are more segregated now than they were in the 1970s. Cities are slightly less segregated racially, but class-based urban segregation is more intense now than it has ever been, a circumstance that could perhaps be explained by the post-movement admittance of a small, non-white wing to the middle and upper classes. In the overturning of key parts of the Voting Rights Act, the disenfranchisement of felons, mass incarceration, gerrymandering, and the various other forms of voter suppression have meant that even that most basic victory, voting rights for all, may have been achieved in law, but has remained sufficiently non-existent in practice to put Donald Trump in the White House. Just as suppression of black voters kept the Democrats empowered in the post-Reconstruction South, so does it keep the Republicans viable today. The history of the black freedom struggle, alongside the histories of the associated and sometimes overlapping feminist, American Indian, Chicanx, Asian American, Puerto Rican, disability, queer liberation, and anti-war movements, has been mythologized and mystified. This mystification serves in the present day to divide us in our movements. Sorry about that. It keeps those willing to follow the credo, quote, by any means necessary, end quote, isolated and marginal. Props up non-threatening forms of resistance while attacking those who take the biggest risk and the biggest leaps to get free. There is an increasingly clear historical consensus that there was never a purely nonviolent civil rights movement. The majority of those who worked within the nonviolent tradition treated nonviolence as an effective tactic, not a moral philosophy. Furthermore, to the degree that nonviolence was an effective tactic, it was so only because of it. Furthermore, to the degree that nonviolence was an effective tactic, it was so only because of a historical combination of national and international dynamics, chiefly Northern disdain for Southern backwardness and Cold War competition for influence over newly formed post-colonial governments in the global South, that allowed Northern liberals to side with Southern black activists to force the federal government to care about its moral image in the world. And still, even under those circumstances, nonviolent campaigners were often protected by force of arms, and many campaigns, quote, devolved, end quote, into decidedly not nonviolent rioting and direct action. To understand riots and social movements today, tactically, strategically, and historically, many of us must transform our image of the Black Freedom Movement. We cannot afford to think of the Black Freedom Movement as made up of simple divisions between nonviolence and militancy, civil rights and black power, South and North, leaders and masses. Those historical and conceptual divisions were used then and are used now to appease white liberals and to enforce the white supremacist strategy of divide and conquer. The rioter and the looter were as fundamental to the movement as the freedom rider and the bus boycotter. They are deserving of just as much honor, gratitude, and study. Okay, and that brings us to our first, I'm not sure what the proper literature term is for this, but our first little checkpoint in this chapter. They got the 3 matches, which sort of symbols the turning of the topic in some sense, within the chapter. And so, again, we just read through the first four pages of chapter 6, No Such Thing as Nonviolence, in the book In Defense of Looting by Vicky Osterwile. I usually like to interject a little bit more often than I did right there, but I just wanted to sort of gather all my thoughts. Some of these things are more, this specifically, out of all the things that we've read, not only is this the section that in a period of time that I'm the most informed about from other previous readings and studies, but also it is so far the section that is closest to relating to some of the things directly that we are facing in the struggle that we're dealing with now in Rockford, Illinois, in the struggle to end police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice. And so I want to start with the Black Lives Matter, you know it. Thank you. Love y'all. Be safe out here. And so what I want to do is take some time to talk about that title of that chapter, No Such Thing as Nonviolence. I think that was one of the first things, one of the earlier things that I learned throughout all of this is that the concept that it takes two to tango. And so that means that, in order for something to be nonviolent or something to be peaceful, it means that all parties involved have to be dedicated to nonviolence and have to be dedicated to some sort of peacefulness. And what has been the history here in the struggle to end police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice is that the people that are being protested are the ones who do not adhere to peacefulness. The people being protested are the ones, or not the people, but the institutions being protested is the ones that do not adhere to peace and that adhere to violence. The most violent party on May 30th was the Rockford Police Department and law enforcement agencies. It was not people who came to protest. It was not people who came to demonstrate. But all in all, the same thing must be said, that the amount of coverage that was given on May 30th, the amount of reaction that was given after May 30th goes to show that, as Vicky is pointing out, that there were certain things that happened throughout that day that registered, that other things that did not happen, that did not occur again, that have been shown to not register the same. On May 30th, there were stores looted. There were stores that were damaged. Rocks, they always talk about the rocks that were thrown in District 1 and some of the damage done to the things in District 1. And that damage of property and that loss of property is what led to the mayor coming out with all of these different quote-unquote black community leaders, and is what led to the mayor putting on these goofy masks that said listen, and all of these smoke and mirror tokenist actions that came forward not because human life was lost or damage to life was done, but because the damage to the property, but because the damage to the image of the city. And then you seen after a damage to life, after a life was struck, when Tyrus Jones was shot, that the mayor wouldn't even come out with a statement. But what would have happened if after Tyrus Jones was shot, if the things that happened on May 30th would have occurred, you would have seen him come with the press conference and say Tyrus Jones' name. You would have seen a more concerted effort from the city and the government, the Rockford City government and the mayor's administration to empathize with the community and to humanize this issue. The same thing, and these things reverberate to when Denzel Duvant was assaulted, and reverberate to when Faustin Guaitigo was murdered, and reverberate to when Jose Gonzalez Jr. was shot while running away. way and reverberate all the way to Raymond Jackson being killed in a killed in a high-speed pursuit. If after each one of these incidents there would have been uprisings, if after each one of these incidents there would have been some type of destruction of property or some type of damage to the image of the city through these actions, what you would have seen is a rollout of these white racist officials trying to pretend as if they care about the community and they care about these issues. And again, until we get to a place where we're at least forcing them to pretend, we will never get into a place where we have them genuinely caring about it. And again, I'm not saying that, and this is me reflecting on what is the things being brought upon in the book. This is not me stating what people should or shouldn't do. Again, this is an ideological conversation. This is a theoretical conversation, but it's a conversation that must be had. You must look and see that the closest we've come to justice when it comes to these police slayings and these police lynchings has been what happened to Derek Chauvin, and you see what had to happen in Minneapolis in order for that to occur. You see what had to happen in all these other cities and states in order for that to occur. And on average, 900 to 1,000 people are murdered by police officers in this country annually, and it's the exception for what happened to Derek Chauvin to be what happens, because it's the exception for what happened after George Floyd was lynched to happen. But if it became the rule that what happened to George Floyd after George Floyd was lynched happened, it will become the rule of what happened to Derek Chauvin. And in the midst of those things happening, you will see these police departments and these city governments begin to clean up their house as they were in fear of it burning down. But as long as they don't fear it burning down, as long as they don't fear that status quo being destroyed, as long as they don't fear that racism being destroyed, as long as they can feel people trying to go in and around it and compromise, they'll continue to maintain that status quo. What up, what up, what up? And so I think that's one thought that I had through there. And then I think another one of the thoughts I had is that I loved how Vicky made sure to point out that there was no separation between Malcolm X and By Any Means Necessary and Bobby Seale and Huey Newt and Black Panthers and Angela Davis and Kwame Ture, formerly known as Stokely Carmichael, from Martin Luther King Jr. and Andrew Young and James Meredith and all of these other people who took on different tactics, because all of these things were happening at the same time. I've read the autobiographies of different of these men, and Andrew Young, who was closely affiliated with Dr. King and in the nonviolence movement, spoke highly of Malcolm X and spoke of having a dinner with Malcolm X and understanding some of Malcolm X's ideology. And Dr. King speaks about in the autobiography that was put together after he was assassinated, he speaks about some of the agreements he has with Malcolm and some of his disagreements ideologically, and the agreements he has with the Black Power movement that was, and I don't even, again, not saying emerging, because I do agree that the Civil Rights movement was the Black Power movement, was the Black Liberation movement. The lines are too blurred, to actually separate the two. The Black Panthers were being created and organizing and mobilizing at the same time that Dr. King was speaking about Vietnam and having a little bit of a philosophical change about how willing the white community and how willing white America and America was towards actually ingratiating Black people into integration and true integration and things of that nature. So I think that was another thing that was important. That has been something that I found out that there is, to me, and this is my opinion, there is no Malcolm X without Martin Luther King Jr. There is no Malcolm X without all the other Elijah Muhammad and all of these other different people who, whether you agree with them 100% ideologically or not, each one of these people and then the people behind them whose names we don't even know, and all the movements and the moments that we don't know, they all work together in this time to push the needle forward and to force the climate and to force the culture to change. And I do agree when Vicky speaks about how it's another myth or a lie that that was something that they won then. I don't believe I don't believe there's ever been a time in which black people have been in this country in which you could say that they won because of what we've spoken about happening often in this book. The idea that you can take damn, what the hell. Yeah, the spider. Okay, because of the fact that so often, or because of the fact that historically, whenever black people and people of color and poor people, working class people have taken 2 steps ahead in America, it's been followed up by them being forced to take 1 step back, or take 2 steps back, or take 4 steps back, and so we are the struggle that our ancestors. What we're waging in the 50s and the 60s and in the 50s and the 60s and in the early 70s, that struggle continued to be waged through the 80s and through the 90s and through the 2000s. Again, it's ebbs and flows of all of these things, and that is the same struggle that we're waging now. And so I think that was another thing I thought was very well put. And again, I think that this last sentence here, this last couple of sentences, those historical and conceptual divisions were used then and are used now to appease white liberals and to enforce the white supremacist strategy of divide and conquer. The rioter and the looter were as fundamental to the movement as the freedom rider and the bus boycotter. They are deserving of just as much honor, gratitude, and study. And I agree with that 100%. It's the same thing here. Just as instrumental and necessary as I have been to the struggle, the same thing is for the name of somebody who I don't know who came out to one of the die-ins early on and laid down for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. They've been just as instrumental as the people that on May 30th went and took actions that would be tantamount to looting or tantamount to rioting. All of those, everybody who has taken any action in the struggle to end police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice, regardless of what any other person may believe or think about it, or how they may judge those actions, that the action has been necessary. The action has been integral because of the fact that there have been such a lack of actions leading up to this point when it comes to genuinely addressing police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice in Winnebago County. And so, here, let's hop back in. I'll try to not wait so many pages to have some thoughts. Okay, we're on page 144 of In Defense of Looting. No Such Thing as Nonviolence, Chapter 6. The Black Freedom Movement was at its most powerful and its most visible during the years 1955 through 1975. But the struggle did not begin suddenly in 1955, when Rosa Parks refused to give up her bus seat to a white passenger in Montgomery, Alabama. Intense civil rights struggles ensued throughout the 40s. By 1955, however, these movements had been decimated by a massive wave of political and social repression organized under the banner of anti-communism. When the civil rights movement finally blossomed into national prominence, it grew from the ashes of a radical social justice movement dismantled by McCarthyism. As France fell to Hitler's Blitzkrieg armies in 1940, the United States embarked on an incredible expansion of defense spending and industrialization as it prepared to enter the war in Europe. It was this massive wave of military production that finally ended the Great Depression. The U.S. government also began a military draft, which kicked into overdrive as the United States officially entered the war in December 1941. By the end of the war, 19 million men had been drafted into the U.S. Army. War production created a lot of jobs, and more still were vacated by drafted young men. Most of these jobs were in heavy industry. Up until the war, this type of job had largely been the exclusive domain of white men, protected and maintained as such by racist union organizing and management hiring policy. But war destabilizes such traditions, and black, Asian, and Chicanx men and women, as well as white women, were suddenly hired to fill the need for rapid production. To get these jobs and to escape the white supremacist violence of segregationists, millions of black people migrated out of the South in what historians call the Second Great Migration, the largest internal migration in American history. Okay, and then there's a quotation at the bottom we'll read. This migration was most pronounced on the West Coast, where black populations grew exponentially in San Diego, Oakland, LA, Richmond, and other cities with naval production centers. But many laborers also went to Detroit, Chicago, the Twin Cities, and St. Louis, as well as Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York, and Boston. The migration continued for 2 decades after the war, though at a slower rate. Many of those who stayed in the South moved out of the fields and took jobs in cities like Charlotte, Memphis, or Atlanta. The second migration can also be understood as a movement of black urbanization by its completion. 80% of the black American population lived in cities. The period also saw a massive number of Latinx workers and families migrate to the same production centers. Much of the racial makeup of American cities was determined in these years, although migration from Southeast Asia, China, Central America, and Mexico post-1970, much of it in response to the Vietnam War and other U.S. imperialist violence, would further transform the West, while Caribbean migration changed the Gulf states and migration from Brazil, North Africa, and Middle East transformed the Midwest and East Coast. White flight and then gentrification have caused white populations to fluctuate dramatically in contested urban cores to this day. My grandfather was born in Mississippi, and he moved up here. Would be part of what would be the second Great Migration. And from that point, my family has been in the Midwest, and I know a lot of people who that has been the case for, who, and I think one of the things that we'll never understand is the type of, and I mean, you can understand it. There's a book called The Warmth of Other Suns, which speaks a lot about the Great Migration, which we'll read at some point here. There's a book called The Color of Law, which we read, which sort of speaks about in different portions the Great Migration, the Second Great Migration, and it just tells you the type of psychological trauma that was being dealt to black people as they lived in the South, to the fact that they felt that they had to go somewhere else to try to grasp at freedom or grasp at liberty. And often what happened is they would move to the Midwest, or move to the North or the East, or move to the West, and they would be met with the same racism, just in a different form. They would be met with the same discrimination, but just with a different form, with a different face. So I think that that's one of the things that is very interesting about how the racial makeup of America got to be where it was at. I think that was one of the things I found very interesting, is just the great mass of people that were leaving the South during this time. And it just goes to show you that there has never been a time in which white America has felt incumbent to, as a whole, as a collective, to try to change these issues. When the South wouldn't try to change it, people of color moved to the East and to the West and to the North, and then those people who frowned upon the way the South handled their racism still conducted racism. They just did it in a different manner. One of the other things that was spoken about here is how segregation, earlier on they spoke about how segregation still exists now, and how schools are more segregated now than in 1970s. This is a book that was written in 2020, released in 2020, excuse me. And we live in a city in which that is 100% the case, and it's historically been the case. We live in a city that was, we say it all the time, named in the lawsuit RPS 205 versus the People Who Cares lawsuit as having racism down to a science, of being it was accused of being one of the most segregated school systems in American history. And so we here lived through that. We've lived through those things. People saying that you could sue the school system now on the same basis and win the lawsuit. And so, again, part of reading through all of these things is making sure that as we read through them, we can cross-reference the things that we're reading to the issues that we're facing in Rockford, Illinois, and in Winnebago County today. So that way we're not just arbitrarily taking in information. Okay, let's pick this back up. All right, we're on page 155. They left sharecropping and domestic servitude behind, hopefully forever, for the promise of higher wage jobs and less discrimination in industrial urban centers. As one woman who worked in a factory during the war sardonically put it, quote, "Lincoln may have freed the slaves, but Hitler was the one that got us out of the white folks' kitchen, end quote. But the needs of war production did not suddenly turn American capitalists into champions of racial equality. But the needs of war production did not suddenly turn American capitalists into champions of racial equity and justice. Black workers still did the worst jobs in the plants and at lower pay than white people in the same positions. Black migrants ended up in red-line neighborhoods and faced terrible treatment at the hand of northern whites, particularly landlords, police and bosses. As a result of all these factors, World War II was a period of intense racial conflict and social movement on the home front. Riots occurred across the country, especially during the summer of 1943. The most infamous incident is the June 1943 Zoot Suit riot, which saw gangs of white servicemen attack Mexican and black teenagers in Los Angeles for wearing oversized, baggy zoot suits of subversive, countercultural, and, in the face of wartime, wool rationing, anti-militarist fashion. A few weeks later, a white versus black brawl turned into a massive riot in Detroit, one of the largest race riots of the 20th century, in which 34 people were killed in 60 hours of combat that was only quelled when federal troops intervened. But rioting was not the only form of social conflict in the period. In 1941, A. Philip Randolph, leader of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, planned what would become known as the First March on Washington to protest segregation in the armed forces and the defense industries. As it became clear, a week before the march, that he had organized more than 100,000 people to move on D.C., President Roosevelt panicked. Via executive order, FDR banned segregation in the war effort and created the Fair Employment Practices Committee. As a result of this victory, Randolph called off the march but kept the organizational infrastructure in place, turning it into the March on Washington movement. The Fair Employment Practices Committee proved to be another of FDR's canny concessions. It lacked enforcement mechanisms sufficient to create real integration, which again is one of the commonalities is, and this is what happens when you do not force the climate to change before legislation changes. This is what happens when you do not force the culture to change before laws change. This is what happens when you do not force the mindset to change before you change the politicians and the city leadership. Is that you get people in there who will give you appeasements that have no strength in them, that will give you citizens review boards that don't have subpoena power, that don't have any real teeth, that will give speeches in which they speak as if they understand your plight, and then the moment that your plight manifests itself in some type of event, they will turn your back on you. Because they don't really believe the things that they are saying, because they don't really believe in this legislation or these laws. They're doing it to appease, and they're doing it so that you don't accumulate the power to remove the people who don't believe from their positions and to put people who do believe in those positions. And I don't just mean elected positions. I mean in positions of community leadership. I mean in positions of having platforms. And so that is one of the things that we have to stop allowing to happen, is allowing ourselves to be hoodwinked and bamboozled by these political foxes and political wolves, and by these white people who smile in your face and stab you in your back, and take pictures with you, and then won't even say the name of the people who look like you when they get shot by the police. Okay, let's continue. The Fair Employment Practices Committee proved to be another of FDR's canny concessions. It lacked enforcement mechanisms sufficient to create real integration. Still, MOWM could claim victory, and it gave agitators a framework for action. Alongside the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, which, with the brilliant Ella Baker as new director of branches, would see its membership grow 10 times during the war, Congress of Racial Equality, CORE, and other activist groups, MOWM continued to fight against defense industry segregation, successfully forcing more federal action in 1943. MOWM took a militant and radical approach with an all-black membership, a reliance on direct action, and open support for armed self-defense and, quote, fighting the war against racism, end quote, at home. Local movements for work and housing justice also spread throughout the country, with pickets, boycotts, and marches among the most common tactics. As America fought a war in Europe against fascism, American leaders were forced to publicly denounce the racist logic that animated it. Black people called out the hypocrisy, pointing to racial discrimination in the United States and demanding a, quote, double V, end quote, victory over fascism at home and abroad. And the U.S. allyship with the USSR meant the government had to stop promoting anti-communism, which since 1919 had been a potent force of social control. Indeed, propaganda and political pronouncements of the time praised the Soviet Union. As a result, let me see. Okay, my fault. I just want to see what our page looking like. We got about 10 more chapters. Oh, 10 more chapters. We got 10 more pages. We don't got 10 more chapters. We got like 4 more chapters. All right, I'm gonna knock this page out, and then I'm gonna stop it for now, and then I'm gonna try to hop back on again later today. I want to keep trying to shoot for a chapter a day. Still trying to shoot for a chapter a day. Okay. As a result, communists and radicals of all stripes, whose movement had embedded dramatically from their revolutionary heights in the mid-30s, as a result, communists and radicals of all stripes, whose movement had ebbed dramatically from their revolutionary heights in the mid-30s, were able to organize more openly. The Communist Party USA, CPUSA, with the large black membership, reached 75,000 strong in 1939, although much of the party's working class base had left the party, and it was increasingly made up of professionals and the middle classes. Unions that had been whites only opened up with the influx of black workers into their industries, and as emboldened radical voices took center stage in the labor movement. And so, a social justice movement involving black communists, reformers, and activists, unified with radical segments of labor, grew around demands for better housing, economic justice, and an end to Jim Crow and police violence. Meanwhile, within the armed forces, resistance grew in the ranks of black soldiers. It is not stressed in heroic remembrances of the war, but the U.S. military was segregated. The irony of a Jim Crow army fighting in the name of anti-fascism was not lost on black soldiers. As Japanese citizens were shipped off to FDR's concentration camps, the vast majority of black soldiers were shipped around the world as laborers, not combatants. Something like 90% of the black men who went through basic training spent their service in work crews behind the lines, often doing hard, dirty work under miserable labor conditions, sometimes under white army officers/overseers pulled straight out of the sharecropping South. The black regiments that did face battle, meanwhile, were deployed into continuous action on the front lines for much longer stretches than white regiments, which also received more rest and lived in better conditions in camp. Okay, then we'll stop right there. And then that just makes me think, as we end this, oh, damn. I don't know how long that's been frozen. So I don't know what the last things that was said on the camera were. All right, we're going to stop there. We'll be back with the rest of the chapter later. I'll watch the video, see how much of the end of it still caught on there. We outside.